In the spring of 1954, the community hall in a small Waikato town smelled of beeswax, wet wool, and the sharp sweetness of homemade lemonade. The band played a slow waltz that drifted out into the cool evening air. Arthur, 43 and still living in the narrow cottage his father had left him, stood near the supper table with a cup of tea he had no intention of finishing. He had come only because the church committee had asked for men to help set out chairs. He stayed because the music made the silence in his head quieter for a while. His mother had died when he was 8. The stepmother who replaced her had made it clear in 100 small cruelties that he was surplus. He had grown careful and quiet and alone. Across the room, Margaret stood with her hands folded over a handbag. 52, recently divorced after 20 years of careful silence and careful bruises. She had come because her neighbour insisted the dancing would do her good. She had not danced. She only watched the floor and measured the distance to the door.
They met when Arthur offered her a cup of tea, and she accepted it because refusing would have required speech she did not yet trust herself to make. They spoke of the weather, then of the band, then of nothing in particular. When the last waltz was called, he asked her to dance. She said yes. They married 6 months later in the same hall, with few guests and no fuss. Arthur had found someone who did not flinch when a door closed too hard. Margaret had found a man whose hands never rose in anger. That was enough. He was impotent. They did not speak of it much. Instead, they adopted a boy, 3 years old, with solemn eyes and a tendency to stand very still when voices were raised. They named him David. For a time, the little house felt almost full. Margaret's daughter from the first marriage, Elaine, was 17 when David arrived. She had watched her mother absorb every blow and every apology, and the watching had not made her gentle. It had made her precise. She looked at the quiet man who now sat at her mother's table and at the small boy who called him Dad, and something cold and exact settled in her.
Years passed. Arthur worked the dairy farm. Margaret kept the house and the accounts. David grew. Elaine left, returned, left again, always circling, always measuring what was hers by right of blood and suffering. When Arthur's heart gave out one wet July morning in 1971, Elaine came home for the funeral and did not leave. She spoke softly to her mother about rest, about proper care, about how a widow of 69 should not be alone with a grown son who was not even blood. Margaret, already shrinking inside her grief, let the arrangements be made. The house was sold. The money was placed where Elaine could reach it. David was told, with careful kindness, that he was no longer needed. The last conversation happened on the veranda of the old place, the day the furniture was loaded. Elaine stood with her arms folded, the wind tugging at her coat.
"Of course I hate you," she said. "I hate your father too, and she is no better." David left with a suitcase and the knowledge that the only home he had ever known had closed its doors. Margaret lived another 9 years in a cheap rest home on the edge of town, where the linoleum was always slightly sticky and the tea arrived lukewarm. She grew frail and quiet. On the rare occasions Elaine visited, the talk was of practicalities. David was not mentioned. When Margaret died, the nurse found her facing the window, as though she had been waiting for someone who never came. The last waltz had ended long ago. The music was gone, and the hall was empty.